Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So, Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about the books that I have recently read. I'm filming this right now on Thursday, December 29th. I am not sure if that's when it will actually get uploaded. It's been an interesting, I'll say, week or so here in Connecticut, where I live. Last week on Thursday night, a pretty bad storm went through, and it actually knocked down a tree, which pulled down power lines right near my house. So we lost power for 2 days. And when the company tried to put the power back on, I guess they didn't realize that the tree was down, and it created a terrible power surge, which, come to find out, fried our internet wires.
Backing up, guys.
So I am actually without internet right now. It's been about a week since I've had any kind of internet. So I'm filming some videos today, and then I'm gonna, once they're all done and edited, I'm gonna try and drive somewhere and see if I can find some Wi-Fi and upload them. So it's being filmed on Thursday. I don't know if it'll actually be released on Thursday. So we shall see. But I do have 3 books to talk about briefly. They all relate to history, but they're all a little bit different. Excuse me. The first one is A Fatal Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, Murder in Ancient Rome by Emma Southon. So I did this as a group read. 2 other individuals. There's Stephanie, a frequent, she's a subscriber, and I do a lot of history reads with her. And also somebody newer to me, Sabrina, who has become my Latin language study buddy. Every week we check in on how our Latin studying is doing and compare notes. So the 3 of us read this book together. And I'd say the topic is fascinating. It really, I wasn't sure what to expect. I didn't know if this was just going to be kind of a list of salacious acts and, heinous slayings, which of course could have been interesting in its own right. No, it actually creates a lot of opportunities for some really fascinating discussions about civilizations, about how the state handles things like personhood, who is actually responsible or culpable when it comes to murder. What's the difference between murder and homicide? Are they always the same thing? There's all these different things that this gets into, and it does it really, really well. I like the way this book was organized. Like I said, the topics it brings up are fascinating, and I have to give credit to Southon. In the introduction, she kind of talks about how, so many people love watching like documentaries about murderers and serial killer podcasts and things like that. And she says that she's one of those as well. And I was a little bit wary when I read that, not as a judgment call, but I wasn't sure how she was going to approach murder in this, and if it was going to be sensationalized. But really, it's not. To her credit, I think she always remembers the victims, and so many of the victims are nameless. They were slaves they weren't even considered humans. They weren't considered at all as deserving of life to the Romans around them. Some of them are women, some of them are children. She talks about, murder was not something that the state dealt with, unless it was somebody like, high up, like an emperor. They were killed, of course. But if it was a murder, it was dealt with in families. And by family, we mean more like mafia type family, big families. They're like political entities. But sometimes it can be very difficult to find justice for a murder. So they would erect these murder stones, basically like these stones that had carvings in about how their loved one died and who at least they thought was responsible. And that might be the only justice that they saw. So she has great descriptions of things like that. And also of like graffiti that was put up during, about gladiators killing each other. Mosaics. I was kind of surprised with how descriptive she is with some of the evidence that there's actually no images in this book. There's nothing. There are no photographs, no drawings or anything. which I thought definitely could have helped. That would have been great to see some of the things that she was describing. Just thought it was a weird choice not to have any kind of images in here at all. If you're going to publish a hardcover book, might as well have some in there. But it's not in there. But I will say that one thing that it threw me off a little bit is the way that she approaches this as far as language. She does have something of a gratuitous use of the F word. Now, these ears are not virgin at all, but it comes off sometimes as a little bit too try hard. It gets kind of distracting. Like it's there when it doesn't really need to be. Sometimes it's appropriate, but there's that, and that you add to that. One of the things that we discussed in our group read was a lot of the references that she has in here. Modern day references are very timely, and probably are not going to age very well in the next 5, 10, 20 years or so on. And I feel like that use of language, of profanity, and also the timely references, that probably works very well in a classroom setting. Like, she would probably be great as a college professor to sit inside one of her classes. And I think it might have been Stephanie or something like that, and our buddy Reed, who mentioned that it would probably also work very well as like a podcast. But we all kind of agreed that when it comes to reading a book, we like our books to be a little bit more timeless on the shelves. So it kind of detracted a little bit from our enjoyment, but not overall. I think all three of us actually really still ended up liking this book quite a bit. So yeah, I would definitely read something by Emma Southon again. I thought that the topic was interesting, the organization, all the different facets that she goes through, from domestic killing to gladiatorial killing to imperial killing. All of that was really fascinating, really riveting. It was, I just kept plowing through this whenever I had the time to read. So very compulsive reading. I would highly recommend it, as long as you can take the gratuitous F word, all the F bombs that are in here. The next thing that I read was, that the Roman book was a work of popular history. This is not. This is Anglo-Saxon Military Institutions on the Eve of the Norman Conquest by C. Warren Hollister. This was originally published in the early 1960s, I believe, in 1960. And this edition was republished in the 90s, I believe. And I love Anglo-Saxon history. I did my my undergraduate paper when I was getting my bachelor's degree in history on the rise and fall of Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king who fell at Hastings. So I've read quite a bit on this topic, and I remember I did kind of recognize the name when I saw this actually in a Goodwill. I was surprised how perfect a match this was for me to find inside a charity shop. But essentially, this is a scholarly work. It is written for other people who are very knowledgeable about the topic. And luckily, I had read enough to know most of the references that he's talking about here, and the people, even though it's been a while since I had read those books. And this is not about, this is not a recounting of battles and a detailed description of all these tactics and stuff. It's more about how the military was organized leading up to the fall of the Anglo-Saxon, kingdom, leading up to Hastings. Who was in the army? How was it recruited? You get the Fjord, the select Fjord, the people who are kind of the professional soldiers, and you have the Great Fjord, the locals basically, who were called up when there was an invasion and they needed to come about. What were their responsibilities? How much money would they have to? Would they be paid? And if you were an earl, what was your obligation to the king? And not just in land, but also in naval capacity. Who was providing ships? It's that sort of thing. And this is also a little bit of a corrective as well. It seems like historians of the early 20th century largely dismissed or highly underestimated the Anglo-Saxon army. They often depicted Hastings as the kind of continental feudal, horseback knights, cavalry, overrunning a very old-fashioned obsolete type of warfare that the Anglo-Saxons were still fighting. And he says in here that's not really the case at all. The Normans and the Anglo-Saxons actually had very similar strategies, very similar tactics. Yes, there was some cavalry at Hastings, but it was not necessarily the the thing that turned the tide. There's many accounts of Normans actually riding to battle and still dismounting, just like the Anglo-Saxons did after Hastings. So he's basically saying that no, the Anglo-Saxon army was actually far more advanced than earlier historians had given it credit for. And the fight between Harold Godwinson and William, Duke of Normandy, was way closer than those earlier historians have given credit as well. So in large part, it's a corrective. Now, it was a pretty quick read, around 150 pages or so. But, I would only recommend this to people who really were interested in the topic and also had some background already in at least the few decades leading up to Hastings. But anyhow, I really enjoyed this. I thought this was excellent scholarship. The last thing that I read, very different, but still history related, is excuse me, this graphic novel by Jacques Tardi. I think he's often just credited as Tardi, if I'm saying his name correctly. This is translated from French. It was The War of the Trenches, and this was originally published, I believe, in 1993. And I think this English translation was published in this edition, I think, around 2010. It was inspired by Tardi's grandfather. Growing up, he had heard stories of his grandfather, who was in World War I. And he essentially, from what I understand, did a ton of research on this to make sure that the equipment, all the images on here were historically accurate, what the men were wearing, how they would have been wearing it, different occasions, if somebody's being executed, would they actually have been blindfolded or not, what circumstances, would they have been tied to a post, would they not have been. He did a lot of research, personal stories that he heard, and also just, photographs and extensive reading. And essentially, this isn't one long narrative. It is more like a bunch of vignettes of soldiers' experiences inside World War I. And it is very much an anti-war type of book. It is the horrors of war, how disgusting and terrible the entire situation is. You see how it's mostly organized into these 3 horizontal panels. How needlessly these men died. Just horrific stuff. And it took me a little while to get into it, but really by the second half, I was just turning each page, and I felt it working on me. Some of the stories are just absolutely tragic, and he does a very good job. As the more you read it, the more those horizontal panels kind of work on you, and you start kind of feeling like you're being bombarded with the horrors of war. It also remind me of the war illustrations of Otto Dix, who wrote some kind of nightmare, or drew some nightmare imagery from stuff that he experienced in the Great War. So it's like Otto Dix, but with speech balloons and and text. So actually a pretty good match as far as I'm concerned. So I would actually highly recommend this. If people aren't, even if they're not used to graphic novels, I think that this is worth checking out and picking up. I thought it was quite excellent. So anyway, those are the 3 books that I finished most recently. We've got A Fatal Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, Murder in Ancient Rome. We've got Anglo-Saxon Military Institutions, and it was The War of the Trenches. If you have read any of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you, BookTube.